President Cyril Ramaphosa recently referred Israel to the International Criminal Court in The Hague for investigation for war crimes and genocide. This echoes many of Israel's global critics. These are defamatory lies against the Jewish state, which isolate and mark the Jewish state and Jews of the diaspora for discrimination, persecution, and ultimately annihilation. I'm Rabbi Goldstein, the Chief Rabbi of South Africa, and here's why I say that. The truth is that the Israel Defense Forces, the IDF, operates by the highest legal and ethical standards of any army in recorded history. The Israeli government has committed the IDF to comply with the international law of armed conflict as set out in the Geneva Conventions, together with customary international law, in terms of which there are two main principles. Civilians may not be the primary target of any military action, and if unintentional civilian casualties may result from a military target, they must be proportional to the military objective achieved. This commitment is not just words. There is an entire legal division established by the Israeli government called the Military Advocate General Corps, and it comprises hundreds of lawyers whose task it is to uphold the rule of law, ensuring that IDF actions comply with international law. When it comes to Israel's aerial attacks, for example, the way it works is that the Air Force has to provide a list of targets to be approved by the lawyers of the Military Advocate General Corps with full explanation for why each target is necessary, the precise military objective, and outline the number of potential civilian casualties. If the legal division is not fully confident that the operation meets the strict requirements of international law in any of these areas, the operation is denied the go-ahead. Even if it is approved, there are a number of controls in place to cancel the mission if circumstances change mid-operation. For example, if civilians enter the field of combat. With regard to the ground forces, a military lawyer is attached to the different battalions to train and direct the commanders on how to comply with international laws. Israel goes to extreme lengths to avoid civilian casualties, doing things no army has ever done, such as warning civilians of pending attacks to prevent loss of life, even if that means sacrificing the critical element of surprise and sacrificing the lives of its own troops by using ground forces in place of aerial bombardment to minimize civilian casualties of the Palestinian people. These international laws of armed conflict are also applied by the Military Advocate General Corps to the broader military strategy. These are ethical standards that no army in recorded history has adhered to. The US Army comes the closest, but the IDF is superior to them in four ways. One is that its legal core is independent of the operational chain of command, which separation ensures objectivity and independence. Two is that the military lawyers can apply to the Israeli Supreme Court for intervention if they deem it necessary to clarify or enforce a point of international law. Three, IDF commanders are bound by the decisions of the Military Advocate General officers, which means that its legal opinions are not merely advisory, but binding. Four, the IDF legal system incentivizes the reporting of potential international law violations, maintaining a culture of accountability and adherence to legal standards. I'll say it again, the IDF operates within stronger legal and ethical constraints than any army in recorded history, in spite of the fact that Hamas cynically uses this adherence as a weapon against Israel. Knowing that Israel will not target civilian areas, Hamas places fighters and weaponry in hospitals, schools, playgrounds. They transport their fighters in ambulances. All of this is publicly documented. Hamas themselves have admitted to it and take pride in it. They use their own citizens as human shields, not only to prevent Israeli attacks, but to maximize civilian deaths on their own side, thereby provoking international backlash against Israel. It's part of their strategy. In this context, the allegations of war crimes and genocide against Israel are absurd and are aimed at its destruction. Implicit in these allegations is that almost zero civilian casualties are acceptable in a situation of war. This means that there is no such thing as a just war, and no such thing as justifiable self-defense. Even if you have literally hundreds of lawyers policing your soldiers, in doing so, these critics deny Israel the right to defend itself. And for Israel, it's an existential fight for survival. Israel's a tiny country. Its entire land area is smaller than the Kruger National Park in South Africa or the state of New Jersey in America. It is surrounded by ferocious, violent enemies who seek its destruction. Iran, with its proxy armies, Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis in Yemen, are encircling Israel and seek its annihilation, something they've stated very clearly on the record. And here are some of the statements. Hamas has said, Israel will exist and will continue to exist until Islam will obliterate it just as it obliterated others before it. And in another statement, there is no solution for the Palestinian question except through jihad. And here is Iran's Ayatollah Khamenei. The Zionist regime in this region is truly a cancerous tumor, and it must be cut out, and it shall be. This barbaric regime of Israel has no cure but to be annihilated. When a nation is confronted with barbaric enemies who seek its annihilation, like Israel is today, then the only recourse is war in self-defense. Those who condemn Israel for any civilian casualties in spite of Israel's adherence to international law are essentially saying that Israel has no right to defend itself. And that means defeat by its enemies whose stated intent is the murder of all Jews. In addition, these false allegations of genocide and war crimes prepare the way for the discrimination, persecution, and ultimately murder of Jews. People who perpetrate or support genocide deserve no empathy or protection. They are a threat to society and ultimately must be eliminated. The stigmatization and then dehumanization of Jews is something we've seen before, and it's described in a book that, although it was published in 2005, has a chillingly relevant title in our context, Warrant for Genocide. Author Norman Kahn writes as follows: throughout the world, in the fateful years 1943 to 1945, people were unwilling to bestir themselves on behalf of the Jews. The very widespread indifference, the ease with which people disassociated themselves from the Jews and their fate was certainly in part a result of a vague feeling that even if there were no elders of Zion, Jews were somehow uncanny and dangerous. And ironically enough, this feeling grew stronger as the persecution of the Jews grew worse. End of quote. If Iran gets a nuclear bomb and destroys Israel, God forbid, people will say, well, they had it coming. They were occupiers. They were perpetrators of apartheid. They were perpetrators of war crimes and genocide. And that's what happened in Nazi Germany. Hitler told Germany and the world that the Jews were responsible for all of the worst ills of society. And so when the Holocaust came, there was no one who stood up to stop it. But the defamatory lies that Israel is responsible for war crimes and genocide don't just threaten the Jewish state, they also stigmatize the Jews of the diaspora. If we support Israel, according to these false allegations, we too must be genocidal and evil. The result of the stigmatization has been only too plain to see: surging anti-Semitism across the world. We're seeing the stigmatization emanate right from the top. On a recent state visit to Qatar, one of the primary funders of Hamas, explaining his actions to refer Israel to the International Criminal Court for war crimes, including genocide, President Ramaphosa said, and I quote, "Gaza is a concentration camp and Israel is perpetrating genocide." End of quote. In making these wild and false allegations, the president has stigmatized and isolated South Africa's Jews, the vast majority of whom love and support the state of Israel. We are proud Zionists. This isn't surprising. Jewish history and Judaism itself is inseparable from Israel. I'm a proud Zionist. I support the state of Israel, and I admire the brave soldiers of the Israel Defense Force in their noble war for survival and the safety of the Jewish people. Almost all South African Jews feel exactly the same way. And so when this government says that Israel is guilty of apartheid, occupation, genocide, and war crimes, they are in effect labeling all of us who support Israel, Jews, but also millions of Christians, as apologists for and supporters of crimes against humanity. In his letter to the nation, President Ramaphosa noted that there is no place for any form of prejudice in South Africa. That, and I quote, "We are a society that prides itself on its tolerance and respect, and there is no place in our society for anti-Semitism." But, Mr. President, your actions belie these words by implying that I and my fellow South African Jews support apartheid, genocide, and war crimes. You send a powerful message to all our fellow South Africans that any Jew who is a Zionist, who is a supporter of Israel, is fair game. You have declared open season on us. This applies on many levels. Let me give you 3 examples. Herzliya, the Jewish school in Cape Town, one of the top achieving schools in the province, known for its remarkable outreach work and as a beacon of light for tolerance and school excellence in our country, has been publicly threatened with violence for its support of Israel and the IDF. It has extra armed guards to protect the children because their school heads dared to express their pride in the Zionist values of their graduates. Cape Union Mart, Poetry, and other businesses of Jewish CEO Philip Kravitz have been subjected to vicious boycott campaigns because Philip is a proud supporter of Israel. Philip was one of the very first business leaders to publicly call on the National Party government to end apartheid and to release Nelson Mandela. Philip is a great South African patriot, an employer of thousands, and a contributor to the South African economy, and he has been vilified, and his crime is that he is Jewish and supports Israel. And now, the captain of the South African under-19 national cricket team, David Teeger, is being the subject of an inquiry by Cricket South Africa for daring to express words of support for Israel and the IDF at a private function. After that event, the PSA, an organization with ties to Hamas and Iran, whose supporters celebrated the killing of 1,200 Jews on October 7, began a hateful campaign against Cricket South Africa. Cricket South Africa has already been through a series of financial and political scandals that have alienated supporters and chased away sponsors. And then it announced that it would now pursue an inquiry into this matric student. Cricket South Africa should be ashamed of itself to subject a young matric boy to a Maoist inquisition to test his ideological purity according to them. Why is it unacceptable for David to publicly express support for Israel and its brave soldiers for defending civilized values and the survival of the Jewish state? What happened to free speech? Why are they only investigating the Jews? All of these actions are simply anti-Semitic. And you, Mr. President, you have set the tone for all of this, because the South African government's targeting of Israel is in effect anti-Semitic. The simple proof is that you, Mr. President, approached the ICC to report Israel for war crimes, with its hundreds of lawyers watching its every move and its operations fully compliant with the rule of law, and yet you did not refer Hamas to the International Criminal Court. Hamas, that on October 7 proudly showed the world how it beheads children, places babies alive in ovens, and kidnaps the elderly for ransom. Here is a list of war crimes as per the Rome Statute definition that Hamas is guilty of based on open source evidence that no one can reasonably dispute. Unlawful initiation of war, intentional targeting of civilian non-combatants, mass murder of civilian non-combatants, torture and inhuman treatment, rape and sexual violence, desecration of bodies, pillage, taking of hostages, Hamas combatants hiding among their civilian population, using civilian buildings such as schools, hospitals, and mosques for military purposes, among many other charges. But Hamas is not the only dictatorship that President Ramaphosa and the ANC government protects. This government steadfastly refuses to speak out against Russia's Vladimir Putin nearly 2 years into his deadly invasion of Ukraine. There's Omar al-Bashir of Sudan, an avowed war criminal convicted by independent tribunals, for whom this government threatened to resign from the International Criminal Court so as to allow his state visit to South Africa. Not to mention how successive ANC governments stood by for decades while President Robert Mugabe and his ZANU-PF militia perpetrated war crimes against the Zimbabwean nation. So when you, as the president of this government, protect the thug regimes of the world from accountability for violations of international law and ethics, while at the same time breaking diplomatic ties with the world's only Jewish state and referring it to the International Criminal Court on blatantly false charges of genocide and war crimes, while not referring Hamas for its war crimes, that is anti-Semitism. It just is. And by doing so, you are directly encouraging South Africans to target and persecute their fellow Jewish citizens. One final point here. In addition to the grotesque allegations of genocide and war crimes against Israel, there is another more subtle form of criticism of Israel, but it is just as lethal. It is those who condemn Hamas, but equate their actions with those of the civilian deaths caused by Israel. People like former President Barack Obama, who says, and I quote, "No side has clean hands," or President Emmanuel Macron, who said that there is no justification for the civilian casualties inflicted by Israel, and many others. All of these people and governments accuse Israel of excessive brutality. Even if they don't go to the extreme of saying it's genocide, they pressure Israel to declare ceasefire before the war is won. They constantly make unreasonable demands of Israel to curtail its military campaign. Denying Israel the right to defend itself properly is a direct threat to its survival. This approach not only threatens the Jewish state, but all free democracies. If a war in self-defense may not be fought even within the rule of law, and no civilian casualties are tolerated at all, then the free world, with its respect for law and human rights, will ultimately be destroyed by barbaric regimes who do not adhere to any laws of armed conflict. If the arguments of today's enemies of Israel had been applied during the Second World War, Nazi Germany would have defeated the Allied forces and we would all be living under the Third Reich. International law accepts unequivocally that a just and legal war fought within the accepted laws of armed conflict can and inevitably will result in civilian casualties. This does not detract from the awful tragedy of such deaths. The Talmud famously states that human life is so precious that to destroy even one life is to destroy an entire world, and to save one life is to save a world. The Talmud also teaches that protecting human life overrides almost all of the precepts of the Torah, and that war is an absolute last resort, and it calls on us to love peace and pursue peace. At the same time, the book of Deuteronomy warns us, and I quote, "Zachor et asher asa lecha Amalek." Remember what Amalek did to you on the way out of Egypt when they attacked you suddenly from the rear, striking the weak when you were weary and exhausted. These verses are a call to remember the first recorded terrorist attack in history more than 3,300 years ago as the Jewish people journeyed from Egypt to Mount Sinai. The nation Amalek attacked the Jews for no reason, an expression of pure hatred and barbarism. Moses appointed Joshua to establish the first Jewish army in history and to lead them into battle to defeat Amalek, which they did. Zachor lo tishkach, remember, do not forget, warns God to all future generations. Why? The message is clear. This was not going to be the last time that the Jewish people would encounter those who practice hatred and violence and seek to destroy the divine values of human dignity and freedom. Lo tishkach, do not forget. Remember to recognize evil, and when you do, know that it must be defeated, vanquished, for if not, it will destroy you. Evil cannot be reasoned with. History has proven this. Neville Chamberlain's appeasement of Adolf Hitler was a catastrophic error. In sacrificing Czechoslovakia, a fellow democracy, to the German dictator, Chamberlain infamously thought he had achieved peace in our time because he didn't recognize that he was up against evil. He tried to reason with Hitler, thinking if he just made one more concession, then war could be averted. The bitter irony is that in seeking to avoid war, he brought it on. And had he followed the approach of Churchill, called a warmonger by his critics, ironically, from the beginning, then tens of millions of lives could have been saved. Martin Gilbert writes that if France and Britain had attacked Germany when it invaded Czechoslovakia, World War II would have been averted, because Hitler wasn't strong enough yet to take them on, and his defeat would have broken his power. And now the world faces Iran as today's Nazi Germany. Through its proxy armies, it is attacking Israel now. But its violent ideology of jihad is a threat to every free democracy in the world. Like Chamberlain in 1938, There are those who are tempted to sacrifice a fellow democracy to keep the peace. But if the free world does not let Israel fight this war to win, they will be next. And the suffering from the wars they seek to avoid will be even greater. We long and pray for a time when God's promise for a redeemed world will be fulfilled, when, as described by Isaiah the prophet, Ki mitzion teitzei Torah udvar Hashem Yerushalayim, from Zion teaching will go forth, and the word of God from Jerusalem. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not lift up sword against nation, nor will they learn war anymore. But that time has not yet come. We are living in an unredeemed world. For good to survive, it must sometimes, with a heavy heart, go to war to defeat the forces of evil. When war cannot be avoided, when all else has failed, when it becomes a battle for survival, then we cannot fear nor falter. We must summon the moral clarity and physical bravery and go forward with resolve to remember, zachor, and never to forget. May God bless us all.